3 terrifying true night shift horror stories. Night shifts can be tough, lonely, quiet, and eerie. But for some workers, those quiet hours are filled with strange, terrifying experiences that stay with them long after the shift ends. Here are 3 terrifying true stories from people who worked the night shift. 1. The Whispering Shadow. Sarah had been working the late shift at a small 24-hour convenience store for about a month when she first noticed something strange. Every night, around 2 a.m., the store would empty out, leaving her alone in the dim fluorescent lighting. But one particular night, as she was stocking the shelves, she heard faint whispers coming from the back of the store. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but then the whispers became clearer. "Sarah, help me." Frozen, Sarah looked around. The store was completely empty, no customers, no staff. She turned the corner to the back room, where the whispers seemed to be coming from, but there was no one there. The door to the storage area was slightly ajar, and Sarah swore she saw a shadow dart behind it. Terrified, she backed out of the room, not knowing what was worse, the shadow or the voice that followed her as she fled to the front. She never worked another night shift at that store again. 2. The Unseen Patient. Mark was a security guard working overnight at a hospital. His job was to make sure that all the doors were locked and that no one entered restricted areas. Around 3 a.m., he was doing his rounds when he passed by an empty hallway. Out of the corner of his eye, he thought he saw a figure standing in one of the patient rooms, but when he turned to look, the room was empty. Curious, Mark approached the room, but the door was locked. It was a common practice for nurses to lock doors during the night to keep patients secure. As he stood there, he heard a soft tapping on the inside of the room. "Who's there?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. The tapping stopped, but the room grew colder. He could feel the air shift, like something or someone was on the other side. Just as he was about to turn away, the door slowly creaked open, but when Mark stepped inside, the room was still and empty, as though no one had been there at all. Confused and shaken, Mark checked the logs. The patient who was supposed to be in that room had passed away 2 weeks earlier. No one had been assigned to the room since. 3. The Cursed Parking Lot. Jessica worked as a late-night receptionist at a hotel. She had heard the rumors about the parking lot, how some guests would report strange occurrences at night, like the feeling of being watched, or hearing footsteps when no one was around. But Jessica never believed in ghost stories until one night. It happened to her. It was 4 a.m., and the hotel was quiet. Jessica was doing her routine, making sure everything was in order, when she noticed something odd. The parking lot outside her window was completely empty except for a single car, its headlights on, shining directly at the entrance. She shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was a late arrival. But when she checked the security footage, the car had been parked there for over an hour with no one inside. Intrigued, she stepped outside to investigate. The cold air hit her as she walked toward the car, but when she reached it, the lights flickered off, no one was inside, and the car doors were locked. Just as she turned to go back inside, she heard footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate. She whipped around, nothing, but the footsteps continued, now right behind her. Her heart raced as she sprinted back to the front door, her mind reeling with questions. To this day, Jessica refuses to park anywhere near that spot, convinced the parking lot holds a dark secret that will never be uncovered. These stories remind us that while the night shift may seem uneventful, it's sometimes the quiet hours that hold the most unnerving secrets. Whether it's strange whispers, eerie shadows, or unsettling footsteps, the darkness of the night can be full of things we can't explain. 4. The Midnight Caller. Lucas was a night auditor at a hotel in a small town, working from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Most nights were routine. Guests checked in, left, or returned after a long day, but one night, everything changed. Around 2:30 a.m., the phone at the front desk rang. Lucas answered, expecting it to be a guest needing something or perhaps a staff member calling in. But when he picked up the receiver, there was nothing but silence on the other end. "Hello?" Lucas said, his voice breaking the stillness. "Can I help you?" The silence continued for a few moments before a faint, whispery voice responded. It was barely audible, but Lucas could make out the words, "Get out of the room." Lucas was puzzled. "What room are you referring to?" he asked, trying to keep his composure. The voice became louder, more urgent. Get out of room 307, now. He glanced at the monitors, checking the guest log, but room 307 was empty. The hotel had no bookings for that room, and it had been vacant for weeks. The line clicked, and the call abruptly ended. Lucas stood frozen, unsure of what to do. He considered investigating the room but quickly dismissed the idea. He knew the stories. Room 307 was said to be cursed. Many employees had reported strange occurrences over the years, and a few guests had claimed to hear voices or see shadows when they stayed there. It was never rented out, and no one talked about it. Around 4 a.m., Lucas decided to check on the room after all. He hesitated before unlocking the door. As soon as he stepped inside, the air turned cold, the lights flickered, and he swore he could hear footsteps behind him. But when he spun around, the room was empty. The phone rang again as Lucas stood there. His heart raced as he answered. Get out, now, the same voice whispered, chilling him to the core. Without thinking, Lucas rushed back to the front desk, locking the doors and staying in the lobby for the rest of his shift. He never worked another night at that hotel again. 5. The dark figure in the warehouse. James worked the night shift at a large warehouse, managing inventory and preparing orders for delivery. He had been at the job for years, and the graveyard shift had become second nature to him. But one night, things took a turn for the worse. James was walking down one of the aisles in the massive storage area when he noticed something strange, a dark figure standing at the end of the row of shelves. He thought it might be another worker, but the warehouse was supposed to be empty. Hey, James called out, his voice echoing in the vast, cavernous space. Is anyone there? The figure didn't respond. It simply stood motionless, its shape unclear in the dim lighting. James felt an icy chill crawl up his spine. He took a step forward, trying to get a closer look, but as he moved, the figure seemed to vanish. Confused, he turned to leave but was stopped by a sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, approaching him from behind. Spinning around, James saw nothing, but the footsteps continued, growing louder. His heart raced as he sprinted down the aisle, looking for the exit. When he reached the main door, he locked it behind him, breathless. For the rest of the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him from the shadows. The next day, he learned that the warehouse had once been the site of a tragic accident years ago, and some workers had claimed to see strange figures in the aisles during late hours. James never returned to work there after that shift, terrified that the dark figure he saw might have been the spirit of someone lost forever in the warehouse. 6. The silent elevator ride. Monica was a night janitor at a large office building. Most of the time, her shifts were uneventful, just cleaning the floors and emptying trash cans. But there was one elevator ride she would never forget. Around 3 a.m., Monica was on the 20th floor, preparing to go back to the basement to fetch some cleaning supplies. She pressed the call button for the elevator, and it arrived after a few moments. The doors slid open to reveal an empty car. She stepped in, pressed the button for the basement, and leaned against the wall. As the elevator descended, Monica felt an eerie, cold draft, even though the air conditioning had been turned off for the night. Suddenly, the elevator jolted to a stop between floors. The lights flickered and then went out completely. Monica was plunged into darkness. She reached for the emergency button, but before she could press it, she heard the sound of someone breathing behind her. Monica whipped around, but no one was there. The air grew thick, and the sound of breathing grew louder. Closer, she turned back to the control panel and frantically hit the emergency button. When the lights finally flickered back on, the elevator was moving again, but it had stopped at the basement floor, completely out of sequence. Monica stepped out of the elevator, heart pounding, but as she glanced up, she saw the reflection in the elevator's glass door, a pale figure, standing behind her, just out of sight. The figure didn't move as she rushed away, and the elevator doors closed behind her. She never rode that elevator alone again. 7. The radio in the dark. Kate worked as a night shift security guard at an old, abandoned school building. It was a place where eerie rumors had lingered for years. The school had been shut down decades ago, but the district kept the building in case they ever needed it again. Now, it was just Kate, alone, patrolling the halls in silence. One night, around 1 a.m., Kate was doing her usual rounds when she heard faint music. It sounded like an old radio, crackling through the air. She paused, thinking it was just her mind playing tricks on her in the quiet of the building. But then the music grew louder, almost as if the radio was right next to her. She followed the sound, moving down the long, dark hallway. The music led her to the old principal's office, a place she had avoided after hearing about strange happenings. The door was slightly ajar, and the radio static was unmistakable now. When she stepped inside, the room was empty, nothing but dust and decay. But on the old wooden desk sat a small, vintage radio. Its dial turned to an old-timey station, playing a tune from a bygone era. The radio wasn't plugged in, but the music was still there, clear as day. Kate's heart pounded in her chest as she reached for the radio to turn it off. But just as her fingers brushed the dial, the music stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie, low whisper, "You shouldn't be here." Terrified, Kate backed out of the room, her heart racing. She didn't look back as she ran to the exit. She never returned to that school again, and the radio was never found again by anyone else. 8. The Midnight Man. Megan worked as a late-night cashier at a grocery store on the edge of town. It was a quiet job until the night she met the Midnight Man. One night, shortly before closing, a man in a long coat walked into the store. His face was hidden under the hood, and he moved with an unnatural calm. Megan greeted him as she always did, but the man didn't respond. He simply walked past her, heading for the back aisles. At first, Megan didn't think much of it, but as the clock ticked closer to midnight, something felt wrong. The man had been in the store for what felt like hours, pacing through the aisles, always just out of sight. Megan tried to stay focused on her duties, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her. When she went to check the security cameras, they were glitching. The footage was static-filled, with long moments of blankness. The man wasn't on any of the screens. Suddenly, the store's lights flickered, and the man appeared at the front of the store, standing right in front of Megan. She froze as he slowly approached the counter, his face still hidden by the hood. As he reached the register, the man leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper, "It's time." The next thing Megan knew, the man was gone. The store was empty. She checked the cameras again, and this time, there was no sign of him. The clock showed that only a few minutes had passed since she last looked. Megan rushed to lock up and went home, but she couldn't forget the chilling sensation she felt. To this day, she wonders who the Midnight Man was and whether he was real, or something far more sinister. 9. The Lonely Hallway. John was a night janitor at a large office building that was always eerily quiet at night. The place was mostly empty by the time his shift started, with only a few workers in the building. He had always hated working late, but it paid the bills, so he did his best to make it through the long, silent hours. One evening, John was cleaning one of the hallways on the top floor when he noticed something strange. The lights in the hallway flickered, then went out completely, plunging him into darkness. He cursed under his breath and fumbled for his flashlight, but when the beam finally cut through the darkness, he saw something that made his blood run cold. At the far end of the hallway stood a woman, dressed in a long white gown, her back turned to him. She was standing perfectly still, staring out of the window at the night sky. John called out, thinking it was one of the late workers. "Hey, you okay?" The woman didn't respond. He walked toward her, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall. As he got closer, he noticed that her hair was long and tangled, and her posture was unnervingly stiff. When he was just a few feet away, he called out again, "Hello?" At that moment, the woman slowly turned to face him. Her eyes were wide open, but they were completely white, no pupils, no irises, just blank, unblinking eyes. Her lips parted, but instead of a voice, an unnatural, deafening silence filled the air. John didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and ran down the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. When he glanced back, the woman was gone. He reported the incident, but the building manager dismissed it, saying that it was probably just a trick of the light. John, however, couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't the only one in that hallway that night. 10. The Forgotten Child. Nina was a security guard at a large, old hotel. The hotel was known for its vintage charm, but it also had a history of strange occurrences. Guests often reported hearing footsteps or voices when no one else was around. But Nina always chalked it up to the building's creaky infrastructure. That was until one particular night. It was around 2 a.m., and Nina was making her rounds, checking the hotel rooms that were closed for renovations. As she walked down the hallway, she heard what sounded like the faint laughter of a child coming from one of the rooms. Puzzled, she approached the door of room 304. The sound of the child's laughter grew louder, but when Nina opened the door, the room was dark and completely empty. There were no toys, no signs of anyone ever being there. Confused, Nina walked out of the room and back into the hallway. As she turned the corner, she noticed a small figure at the far end, standing near the elevator. It was a child, but the way the child was standing, facing the wall, completely still, struck Nina as wrong. "Hey, are you lost?" Nina called out, walking toward the child. But as she drew closer, the child slowly turned to face her, revealing a face so pale and lifeless that Nina froze in terror. The child's eyes were hollow, dark pits, and its smile stretched unnaturally wide. Before Nina could scream, the child vanished into thin air, leaving only an unsettling silence in its wake. Shaken, Nina rushed to the manager's office and asked if any children had been staying at the hotel. The manager seemed confused, then said, "No children have been here for years. There was a child who passed away here long ago. It's said she still roams the halls." Nina never worked another shift at that hotel again. She couldn't shake the image of the child's lifeless face and the cold, empty hallways that seemed to hide more than just old memories. 11. The Phantom Delivery. Matt worked the overnight shift as a night clerk at a small, family-owned hotel. The building was old, its creaky floors and thin walls providing little privacy or comfort for guests. But the job paid the bills. Most of his nights were uneventful, guests came and went, and he passed the time by cleaning or watching TV in the lobby. One particularly quiet night, around 3 a.m., the phone rang. Matt answered it, expecting a late-night inquiry or a guest requesting extra towels. However, the voice on the other end sounded panicked. "Please," the voice said, "I need help. I'm in room 312. Matt felt a chill. Room 312 had been unoccupied for weeks. It was in bad shape and scheduled for renovation. No guests had stayed there in ages. "Are you sure you're in room 312? Matt asked, his voice shaking. Yes, please, hurry," the voice responded before the line went dead. Confused, Matt grabbed his flashlight and headed upstairs, his footsteps echoing through the empty hall. He reached the third floor and was met with an unsettling silence. When he reached room 312, he tried the door, locked. He knocked, but no one answered. Suddenly, he heard a soft thump coming from inside the room, as if something or someone was moving around. His heart raced as he pulled out his keys and unlocked the door. To his surprise, the room was completely empty. The bed was neatly made, the curtains were drawn, and nothing seemed out of place. There were no signs of anyone having been there, and the eerie silence returned. But as Matt turned to leave, a chill swept over him, and the faint sound of breathing filled the air. Looking around the room, his flashlight illuminated a shadowy figure standing by the window, staring outside with vacant eyes. Before he could react, the figure disappeared. Terrified, Matt rushed back to the front desk. The phone rang again as he sat down, and he picked it up slowly, his hands trembling. "Room 312, you should have left it alone," the same voice whispered from the other side. Matt quit his job the next morning and never returned to the hotel. He couldn't explain what happened that night, but he always wondered who or what had been calling for help. 12. The Ticking Clock. Tom was an overnight custodian at an old, decaying library in the heart of the city. The building was huge, with tall, vaulted ceilings and rows upon rows of shelves filled with ancient books. It was the kind of place that gave off a sense of mystery, especially at night. One night, while sweeping the floors near the back of the library, Tom noticed an old clock on the wall. It was a large, ornate grandfather clock that hadn't worked in years. It hadn't made a sound in as long as he could remember. But tonight, Tom noticed something strange. The clock's hands were moving, ticking away as if it were functioning perfectly. He stood frozen, staring at it as it counted down the seconds in perfect rhythm. Curious, He walked closer to the clock. The ticking grew louder and faster as he approached. His breath hitched when the clock's pendulum swung back and forth, casting strange shadows across the room. Suddenly, the clock stopped. Tom stood still, his heart racing, unsure of what he had just witnessed. But before he could turn around, the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the library. It wasn't his own footsteps, these were slow, deliberate, and too heavy to be from a person. The footsteps came closer, and Tom turned to see a figure in the shadows, a tall, hunched figure that seemed to be made of darkness itself. As it moved toward him, the air grew cold, and the footsteps became louder, almost deafening. Tom ran, his mind spinning with fear and confusion. He didn't stop until he reached the front doors. When he glanced back, he could still hear the ticking of the clock echoing through the empty halls, even though it had stopped just moments before. 13. The Forgotten Room. Diana was a cleaning lady at a busy hotel. She worked the graveyard shift, coming in to clean the rooms once the guests had checked out for the night. Most of her nights were long but uneventful until one shift. She was assigned to clean room 103. Room 103 was an old, dusty room that hadn't been rented out in months. The management had been planning renovations, and no one had stayed there in ages. Diana entered the room, expecting the usual mess left behind by a long-ago guest. But as she stepped inside, she felt something was off. The air in the room was thick, stale, as if no one had opened the windows in years. The room seemed untouched, but as Diana walked further in, she noticed something strange. The bed was neatly made, but there was a single rose on the pillow, a fresh rose. She froze. The room had been empty for months. No one had stayed there in all that time. Yet here was a flower that couldn't have possibly been placed there by any guest. As she stood there, the door to the bathroom slowly creaked open. Diana's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't opened the door when she entered, and she hadn't heard anyone else in the room. Slowly, she approached the bathroom, the air around her growing heavier with each step. When she opened the bathroom door, the sight made her stomach drop. A mirror on the wall had been freshly wiped, and in the reflection, she could see a figure standing behind her, a figure that wasn't there when she turned around. The figure in the mirror was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and dark, staring at Diana with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Diana turned to face the mirror, but the room was empty. She checked again and again, but no one was there. The figure remained in the reflection. Diana couldn't leave fast enough. She never returned to clean that room again. 14. The Lost Key. Evan worked as the night manager at an office building. His duties included locking up for the night and ensuring that everything was secure before leaving. One evening, as he was making his rounds, he noticed something odd. One of the office doors was slightly ajar. Curious, he went inside to check. The lights were off, but a soft glow came from a small lamp on the desk. As Evan walked further into the room, he spotted something on the floor, a key. It was small, rusty, and unfamiliar. Evan didn't recognize it, and no one had reported losing a key, so he picked it up and placed it on the desk. But as he did, he heard a soft whisper behind him. "Leave it." Startled, Evan turned around. There was no one there. The room was empty, just as he had expected, but the whisper came again, this time louder and more urgent. "Leave it. You shouldn't touch it." Evan hesitated, but his curiosity got the best of him. He picked up the key and examined it more closely, feeling an odd sense of dread settle over him. Just as he reached for the door to leave, the key slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor, rolling toward the corner of the room. The air grew thick and cold, and the whispers grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. When Evan turned around, the room was still empty, but the door slammed shut with a violent bang, trapping him inside. Terrified, Evan tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. He could hear faint whispers in the dark, growing louder, closing in on him. The door finally opened on its own, and Evan rushed out, leaving the key behind. The building's manager found the key the next morning, but Evan never spoke of that night again. He left his job shortly afterward, unable to shake the feeling that something dark was tied to that forgotten key. 15. The Watcher in the Warehouse. Sophia worked the night shift at a large distribution warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was quiet, isolated, and often felt like she was the only person in the world during those late hours. She had grown used to the empty aisles and the hum of the fluorescent lights above her. But one night, everything changed. It was around 2 a.m. when Sophia was organizing boxes in one of the storage sections. She felt a strange sensation that something was watching her. She brushed it off as paranoia. After all, the warehouse was so vast, and she had been alone for hours. But the feeling didn't go away. Sophia glanced up at the security cameras mounted on the walls. The screens were all displaying an empty warehouse, just as it should be. She continued working, but the sense of being watched only intensified. Suddenly, she heard a faint sound, a soft scraping noise, almost like shoes dragging across the concrete floor. It came from the far end of the warehouse. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew no one else was supposed to be there. Sophia grabbed her flashlight and slowly walked toward the noise, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. As she neared the end of the aisle, she froze. At the far end, standing between two towering stacks of boxes, was a figure, a man, completely still, staring at her. She called out, but the figure didn't respond. He just stood there, unmoving. She took a hesitant step forward, but the man didn't flinch. Panic surged in her chest. She turned and ran back to the security office, her pulse racing. When she checked the security monitors, she saw the warehouse again, empty. No one was there. The figure had disappeared from the screens as well. Sophia never worked another night at that warehouse. Every time she passed by it, she wondered if the man was still watching from the shadows, waiting. 16. The locked room. Rick worked as a maintenance technician at a large office complex, which had several unused rooms that had been sealed off for years. One night, he was called in to fix a water leak on the 12th floor. As he worked, he noticed a door at the far end of the hallway. The door was different, it looked newer than the others and had a fresh coat of paint. He tried the door handle, and to his surprise, it opened. Inside was an office, but it looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. Dust covered the desk. The chair was slightly tilted, and an old-fashioned clock ticked away on the wall. What struck Rick the most, though, was the strange sensation that filled the room. The air was heavier here, thicker somehow, and it felt wrong. He stepped in, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As he walked across the room, he noticed something on the floor, a torn piece of paper. Rick picked it up, squinting at the faded text. It read, "Leave this room. It's not for you." Rick's skin prickled. He stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then he heard it, a faint, whispering voice coming from the corner of the room. The voice was unintelligible at first, but as Rick listened closer, it grew louder. "Leave now, before it's too late." Suddenly, the clock on the wall stopped ticking. Rick turned to leave, but as he reached for the door, it slammed shut on its own, trapping him inside. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of scratching at the walls. Frantically, Rick tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew colder and heavier, and the scratching intensified, as if something was trying to break through from the other side. Finally, the door opened. Rick rushed out, panting and terrified. He never went near that room again, and the next time he returned to the office complex, the door had been sealed shut. No one had any explanation for it, and Rick never spoke about it again. 17. The Unseen Presence. Jared worked as a night porter at a historic hotel located in an old, cobblestone part of the city. The hotel was beautiful, but it had a dark, long history that guests often whispered about: strange noises, flickering lights, and occasional sightings of a woman in an old-fashioned dress wandering the halls. One particular night, Jared was sitting behind the front desk, working on paperwork, when he heard faint footsteps coming from the hallway. He looked up. The hallway was empty. He didn't think much of it at first, but then the footsteps grew louder, more distinct, the sound of shoes tapping against the floor, one step after another. Jared stood up, thinking perhaps a guest was out of their room. He walked down the hall, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. As he reached the end of the hallway, the footsteps stopped. The hotel was silent again. He turned to walk back to the desk, but as he did, he felt it, a cold breeze brushing past him, as if someone had walked right by him. He spun around, but there was no one there. Suddenly, The lights above flickered and dimmed, and in the far distance, Jared saw something, no, someone, standing in the hallway. It was a woman, her back to him, dressed in an old-fashioned gown. Her hair was long and unkempt, and she stood motionless, facing the wall. Jared called out to her, but she didn't turn. He slowly approached her, but as he got closer, the woman vanished. The temperature in the hallway dropped, and Jared could hear soft breathing behind him. When he spun around, there was no one there. The woman, and the footsteps, had disappeared. He never worked another night shift at that hotel. He couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel had an unseen presence lingering within its walls. 18. The Elevator of Death. Clara worked the late shift as an office assistant in a towering building downtown. The building was busy during the day, but at night, it became quiet and empty. Clara often found herself alone in the lobby, working on paperwork and organizing files for the next day. One evening, as she was about to leave, she stepped into the elevator to head down to the parking garage. The elevator was empty, and Clara pressed the button for the ground floor. As the doors closed, the elevator jerked, and then something strange happened. The button for the 13th floor lit up. Clara knew the 13th floor had been sealed off for years due to strange occurrences. No one was allowed on that floor. She quickly pressed the ground floor button again, but the elevator didn't respond. It started to ascend, slowly moving toward the 13th floor. Panic surged in Clara's chest. She tried to stop it by pressing every button, but the elevator wouldn't stop. When it reached the 13th floor, the doors opened, and Clara found herself staring into darkness. The lights were out, and the air was heavy, stale with the scent of old wood and dust. Just as she was about to back away, a faint sound reached her ears, someone, or something, whispering her name from within the darkness. Clara, Clara, come inside. The door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. The elevator dropped, faster than she had ever felt, and then stopped abruptly. The lights flickered back on, and the doors opened to an empty, unlit hallway that stretched far beyond what Clara could see. The whispering continued, louder now. You shouldn't have come here. Clara, heart racing, managed to force the elevator doors open and escape. She ran to the parking garage without looking back, never taking the elevator again. To this day, Clara never told anyone about the experience, but she never stepped foot in that building again. 19. The Mirror's Reflection. Jenny worked as a night receptionist at a hotel that had been standing for over a century. The hotel had an air of history about it, and many guests came from all over the world. But there were always strange stories that came with the building, stories about mirrors that reflected things that shouldn't have been there. 20. The Whispering Shadows. Eric was an overnight security guard at an old, abandoned hospital that had been closed for years. It was a massive building, filled with long hallways and dark, empty rooms. The hospital had been left in disrepair, with peeling paint and rusted machinery scattered throughout. Rumors about the place circulated. People said it was haunted, that the spirits of former patients and staff roamed the halls. One night, during his rounds, Eric passed the darkened emergency room, when he suddenly heard faint whispering coming from inside. At first, he thought it was just the wind or the building settling, but the whispers grew louder, and Eric couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was calling his name. Eric. Eric. The voice was soft but distinct. Hesitant, he approached the door to the emergency room, his flashlight flickering. As he stepped inside, the air grew inexplicably cold. He swept the beam of light across the room, but everything seemed still until he looked at the far corner of the room. There, in the shadows, stood a figure, a tall, thin silhouette that seemed to flicker in and out of focus. Eric's breath caught in his throat, and he instinctively backed away. The whispering intensified. It wasn't just a voice anymore, it was a chorus of voices, all saying his name in unison. Eric. Come closer. Suddenly, the figure in the corner shifted, moving with unnatural speed. Eric bolted from the room, slamming the door behind him, but the voices continued to follow him down the hall, echoing in his mind. That night, Eric left the hospital early, vowing never to return, but he could still hear the whispering, and sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could see the flickering figure in the shadows, waiting for him. 21. The Phantom Call. Rachel worked as a receptionist at a law firm, located in a tall building downtown. The office was usually quiet at night, especially during the late hours when most of the staff had gone home. It was a job she enjoyed, but she had always felt a bit uneasy working alone in the empty office. One night, she was the last person left in the building, finishing up some paperwork. The phone on the desk suddenly rang, piercing the silence. Rachel glanced at the clock. It was nearly 2 a.m., and she wasn't expecting any calls. "Hello?" she answered, her voice echoing in the still office. The voice on the other end was low, distorted, and breathy. It sounded familiar, but Rachel couldn't place it. "Rachel. It's me. I need your help." Her heart skipped a beat. The voice sounded like her late brother, Daniel, who had passed away a few years ago in a car accident. She had always felt a strange connection to him, and she couldn't ignore the familiarity in the voice. "Daniel?" she whispered into the phone. "Is that you?" There was a long pause before the voice responded. "Yes. It's me. I need you." Rachel's breath caught in her throat, and her hand trembled as she held the receiver. She stood up, feeling a sudden chill in the air. "Where are you?" she asked, her voice cracking. The voice was barely audible now, but it spoke again, faint and desperate. "I'm here, Rachel. I'm here." Before she could ask anything else, the line went dead. Rachel stood frozen for a moment, staring at the phone. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. Shaking, she hung up the phone and glanced around the empty office. Everything seemed still, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her. The phone never rang again that night, but Rachel could still hear the echo of her brother's voice in her mind, calling out to her from somewhere in the darkness. 22. The missing patient. Tessa worked as a nurse at a small, remote clinic that operated late into the night to accommodate emergencies. The clinic was quiet, especially after midnight, when most of the patients had already been treated and sent home. One evening, Tessa was tending to a few routine tasks when a man in a tattered coat walked in, looking pale and disoriented. He seemed to be in his late 30s, with dark circles under his eyes. He asked for help in a voice that was barely audible. I need help," he mumbled. "I've been waiting for so long." Tessa led him to an exam room, where he sat down heavily on the bed. She checked his vitals, but his heart rate and blood pressure were unusually low, as if he were fading away. As she began to prepare she asked him about his condition. "I don't know how long I've been here," the man said, his voice weak. "I've been waiting for someone to come, to take me home." Tessa felt uneasy. There was something about the man that seemed off, and his words didn't make sense. She turned to fetch more supplies, but when she returned, he was gone. She rushed out into the hallway, searching for him, but he had vanished completely. No sign of him was found anywhere in the clinic, and the doors were locked from the inside. Tessa checked the entire building, but the man was nowhere to be found. Confused and shaken, Tessa asked the clinic staff if anyone had seen the man. No one had. It was as though he had never existed. The next day, Tessa found an old patient file buried in the back of the clinic's records. It was for a man who matched the description of the patient from the night before. The file was dated over 10 years ago, and it indicated that the man had passed away in the clinic under mysterious circumstances. Tessa's blood ran cold. She had unknowingly treated a ghost, a patient who had been dead for years, but had somehow returned to seek help. The experience haunted her for weeks, and she never worked the night shift again. 23. The empty child's toy. Maria worked as a nurse at a children's hospital on the outskirts of town. The hospital was always quiet at night, and the sound of machines beeping and wheels rolling down the hallway were the only noises that ever filled the silence. But one night, something strange happened. Maria was assigned to a pediatric ward with only a few children in critical condition. It was the middle of the night when she heard a soft, tinkling sound coming from one of the rooms, a lullaby, playing from a child's toy. The toy had been left on the windowsill, its wind-up mechanism having long since stopped, but the music continued, faint and eerie, as if the toy was winding itself. Curious, Maria walked into the room. The child lying in the bed was unconscious, hooked up to a machine. The toy, a small, plush bear with a music box inside, sat on the windowsill, its music playing without anyone touching it. Maria picked up the bear, puzzled. The music stopped the moment she touched it, but she felt a chill run through her as she looked around. The room was colder than usual, and the air seemed thick with tension. As she set the bear down on the bed, the sound of faint footsteps echoed in the hallway, but when Maria stepped out to check, there was no one there. She returned to the room, but the toy had disappeared from the bed. The bear was gone, and no one could explain where it had gone, but from that night on, Maria would hear the faint sound of lullaby music whenever she walked past that particular room, even though the toy was never found again. 24. The Stranger in the Hallway. Greg worked as a janitor in a massive office building that operated 24/7. His shift began at midnight, and it was usually uneventful, but one night, something happened that would haunt him forever. As Greg was cleaning the 10th floor, he noticed a figure standing at the end of the hallway. The man was tall, dressed in a dark suit, and had his back to Greg. It wasn't unusual for people to be in the building late, but this man stood completely still, facing a